Greetings and welcome back to day 2 of our meeting. In the afternoon, we have a session with some really informative and diverse presentations from our pilot project presenters. So pilot project presenters have opportunities through pilot project grants that they seek and are awarded. They're competitive projects typically. These projects are awarded to people who are expanding their research capacity or who may be new in the field. And these are great opportunities for people to really contribute from across disciplines. And we have some great presentations. Each of our presentations will be a 5-minute sort of a TED Talk, a lightning talk, and we're not going to take any questions from the audience until afterwards. We have at least 4 speakers with us right now, maybe a 5th will join us, and after all of our speakers have shared the presentation, we'll open up the session for questions from the audience. Audience members, please do type in your questions in real time, and they'll be forwarded toward the end of the session. Our first pilot project presenter is Dr. Kim Dunleavy from University of Florida, and she'll be presenting her project entitled Effectiveness of Participatory Ergonomic Self-Management Strategies for Clam Farmers with Chronic Lower Back Pain.
Thank you very much, Andy. And hopefully we can get the slides up from now, but the topic of the presentation was this effectiveness of participatory ergonomic self-management strategies for clam farmers. We focused on the Cedar Key aquaculture industry, who have had a long history of putting up with the pain, but high levels of low back pain with disability in numerous people. Just to acknowledge my co-presenters, and that is Dr. Mark Bishop, Ashley Kaufman, Jake Reedy, and Andy Kane. Next slide, please. So the methods that we used were participatory ergonomic self-management intervention strategies. And we used an ABA design, in other words, a baseline of 4 weeks, 8 weeks of intervention, and 2 weeks of post-intervention, where we collected multiple different weekly measures. We looked at developing both individual and team-based strategies to design the interventions that were most relevant for the team workers in this area. And they then selected from a kind of a menu which ones they wanted to use. Most selected a combination of these team-based and individual strategies, such as work breaks or lifting with partners or using mechanical equipment. All of these were refined using earlier interviews, observation, focus groups, and videos. They also discussed these strategies with their workplace team, and we presented on the interventions in the actual workplace itself. They received video feedback. So after we finished these focus groups and they'd selected their strategies, we also videoed the teams on the boat in the equipment processing areas, and they were able to review it, and then they received weekly reminders. Next slide, please. So out of the 28 participants that were recruited, 19 completed the study. All the individuals who did not complete were either related to other medical conditions, some left the industry, and there were a few that in the baseline section just did not have sufficient pain to meet the recruitment guidelines. The 3 sort of areas or 4 areas that were selected most commonly were team lifting, using mechanical equipment, which could either have been on the boat using pulleys or during the lifting and transporting the clams for sorting and packaging. Breaking up the activities, either just physical changes in position or actual work breaks, and rotating tasks were the ones that were the most selected. They did use the strategies for 5 days out of a week. A number of the teams actually worked 6 or 7 days out of a week, and they used them for approximately 50% of the time. Next slide, please. So the results for this cohort were that the disability measured using a standardized instrument called the Oswestry Disability Index, pain with their most painful work tasks. So we asked them to select 3 work tasks that were problematic and attached a analog scale to those 3 work tasks. Pain-related anxiety and also coping all improved from baseline. This was with the pre-post averages on the baseline versus the final. But there were no changes in their perception of how difficult the tasks were. Fear avoidance and self-efficacy, which fear avoidance was actually relatively low, which is consistent with the culture of working through pain. Self-efficacy was pretty high, and so none of those actually changed. Resting pain did not change either. So out of these, we also looked at the number of individuals that reported more pain reduction greater than the variance or the minimal detectable change. And about 74% of the group reported improvements beyond documented variability in the literature for 1 or more work tasks. We calculated their own personal variance from the baseline and looked at how those improved using the pain, and this was also improved 56 to 64%. Next slide, please. So the conclusions was that this does provide preliminary evidence for a very practical option to address low back pain. The elements that we considered useful, selecting the strategies, introducing the changes in the workplace, visual demonstration and videos were very helpful, and that future research does need to account for the variability in pain reports and workload. As with all research, controlled studies and long-term follow-up are needed beyond the sort of pilot level scope. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Dunleavy. That was an excellent presentation, an interesting research approach to meet interesting stakeholder needs. Our next presenter is Chad Nyman from the University of Kentucky. Chad is going to be talking about an app to generate automated access routes from timber harvesting sites for emergency personnel locations. So this is a critical area to be considered. You don't know this unless you're one of those folks working in the field. We don't hear a lot from the timber industry in the region, so we're really glad to have this presentation. Thank you so much, Chad.
Thank you, Andy, for that introduction. As these slides are coming up, this is a pilot of the Logger Safe Route mobile app. Just want to mention the contributions. I served as the PI for this project. Also, Dr. Jeff Stringer as the co-PI, the programming and app development, Daniel Drummond with Southern Research Extension Forestry, and as well as Leslie Bobby and Daryl Outlaw of Southern Regional Extension Forestry. And so this builds upon some previous work by Dr. Jeff Stringer and Dr. Marco Contreras in a web-based version of an emergency personnel response. And so this was funded by the Southeast Center, as many of you all know, SCAHIP. So just some learning objectives for this app, just to raise some awareness of the inherent danger of the logging profession. Logging is regularly and routinely ranked in the most dangerous professions due to that being in remote locations and felling of large trees and heavy equipment used. And these loggers, they are required to comply with regulations to file these emergency personnel locations. So that's a requirement that they've got with OSHA. And so being able to have those emergency plans auto-generated with those directions and access routes from those logging sites to the emergency personnel locations. And those emergency personnel locations are hospitals, police stations, and fire departments. And so just want to point out that this is available both on iOS and Android devices. And it's really, the purpose of it is to leverage adoption of this smartphone technology to try to improve outcomes in emergency situations. And so some of the features of this app is to reduce the time and that burden of that emergency planning for those crews and operations. And so hopefully more folks will do that and do a better job at their emergency planning. And so it provides this ability to quickly receive and convey this location information for access, that's latitude and longitude. And so it improves this emergency personnel response time and those outcomes in a critical situation, or if there is the need for a helicopter medevac or other emergency situation, and being able to improve that accuracy. And so I've got a short video that'll load up here momentarily, but this just shows some of the images that can be screenshotted using these mobile devices. They've got any scale of mapping, as well as directions to these emergency personnel locations. And so we'll go ahead and be able to pull up that video. There we go. And so this mapping system was developed using Google Mappings systems and API. And so it integrates all of those map layers. The user is able to put in their email address when they create their profile, and they can choose between different road layers and aerial imagery to be able to really pinpoint the location of the landing where they will be operating and harvesting. And so as they zoom in and they can check the access points for those sites to be able to ensure that any emergency personnel that would be responding to an incident would be able to readily access that site, make sure that they've got the proper access location, which is something that commonly is an issue. And so, as you can see from this interface here, there's many different layers. They can select that site, be able to put a unique name for that location. It outputs the latitude and longitude for that site. And then it automatically generates that nearest fire department, police station, and hospital. As you can see with the aerial imagery, that exact access location can be checked. And then the user can screenshot any maps that they would want to have on site in a printed form, as well as have those available digitally. And as you can see, that PDF button that's on the top right-hand corner allows the user to quickly send themselves a PDF to the email address with their user profile. And so they can share these maps readily with others within their crew. They can be able to print these to have on site. And so there's multiple copies that can be available. And so that is what I have for today. I appreciate you all having me to talk today.
And we appreciate your contribution, Chad. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Andy.
Next up with us is Ruzman Vilkasim from the University of Alabama at Birmingham, and he'll be talking with us about validation of a low-cost air pollution monitoring sensor for occupational exposure measurements.
Thank you, Andy.
If you can go ahead, DCE, and bring up the slides, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Hi, everyone. I'm Ruzman Vilkasim, and I am the PI for this pilot study. I also like to thank Samuel Stowe, the student who worked on this project. We did some calibrations, and the main idea or the main goal of this project is to test a common low-cost sensor and see if it will perform as well as the more advanced instruments to measure air pollution in occupational settings. So why low-cost sensors? Low-cost sensors are very popular right now for environmental measurements. There are so many out there because one main reason is there's a lot of interest, public interest on low-cost sensors. There's also cheaper technologies now, so more people can use them. They're more attractive. They connect with mobile phones. They have more user-friendly platforms. And of course, it's cheap. You can buy and use more units. And if you look at the industrial standards that are used now for PM measurements, by the way, this is mainly for particulate matter measurements. Our focus was on particulate matter measurements. The industry standards are around $6,000. So it limits the number of people you can sample. And it also has an effect on the workers because you're carrying an expensive equipment that's bigger versus if you have smaller units, which are cheaper and easy to carry, less in weight, it might be better and you can democratize exposure assessment with more people being sampled. But the question is, how good is it compared to the more expensive advanced ones? What about the accuracy and reliability, which is the main idea at the end of the day when we do exposure measurements, right? So the approach was mainly in two fronts. One was we did laboratory testing. So the main aim, like I said earlier, is to test the low-cost sensor unit, a selected unit, and to see if it will be good to measure airborne particulate matter in occupational settings. So in the laboratory testing, what we did was we used a more advanced instrument along with two low-cost sensors at a time, but there were times that we did more low-cost sensors for different aspects to be measured. And we got simultaneous 1-minute measurements to leaf blower smoke. So we had a leaf blower and the exhaust was sent into the chamber, and we measured them simultaneously. So the lab component was completed and we have the results. The second front was to measure it using field measurements. So to use volunteer workers who wore the machines at the same time while they did their work. But unfortunately, because of COVID, it was very difficult to recruit participants for this. So we still had 3 participants and we'll be continuing it further. But unfortunately, it's slowed down a little bit. So what did we find? It's, as you can imagine, the low-cost sensors did have some limitations. But one of the main things we noticed was there was inter-instrument variability. As you can see from the red box, each unit, when you compare it with the more advanced instrument, it had a different curve. So at high concentrations, you'll see more variability between the units, which is okay in a sense if we can calibrate it. But the good thing is that each unit within its curve was reliable. It stayed consistent. So if you know the coefficient, you can use them with the correction factor included. The other interesting thing was below 250 micrograms per cubic meter, there was a more linear relationship. If you can see, the curves kind of plateau when it goes to high concentrations, showing that it's not very well equipped to measure very high PM concentrations, but at lower ranges below 250, even more linear below 200 micrograms per cubic meter, it was linear. And the other issue is that we came across is this is a unit that does not have a physical cut point, or it doesn't have a airflow, and it doesn't, the cut point is not set to an airflow. It's based on algorithm. So we had concerns about the equations that are used. And if you can see in this graph, on the left-hand side, we have an example of the laboratory calibration. You see that it's linear. So we can use, if you have measurements in this range, the results will be more accurate and closer to the real or the more advanced instrument, which is the PDR 1500. By the way, we tested two PDR 1500s together in the same conditions, and they matched very well. And if you can see, the R square is really good, meaning that it maintains consistency, but there is a certain calibration factor that you have to include when you use these units. And on the other side, you'll see a field calibration from one participant. Of course, we couldn't control the concentrations from low to high, so it's all over, but the PDR 1500, the more advanced instrument, seemed to measure it much better, and it was more sensitive to changes. So although the low-cost sensor was able to get roughly close, or several factors different, but the calibration factor was consistent, but the it was not able to measure the variations as quickly or accurately as the more advanced instrument. So what are the main conclusions is, one is the low-cost sensor devices, like I explained, they demonstrated inter-instrument variability, but each unit maintained a high level of correlation with the reference instrument. So it's possible to use it in certain occupational settings, but unfortunately not at very high concentrations, because it plateaus, then your equation changes. The main takeaway from this, I think, should be that low-cost sensors should always be calibrated with a reference instrument. It's very popular now. Everyone's using it for especially environmental measurements, and they just report those values that come out of the unit. These are cheaper units. It doesn't have a physical cut point. It uses light scattering, which is okay, but it has to be calibrated before we use it and interpret the results, more importantly. And then they can still be successfully used, like we saw from the curves, to measure concentrations. Roughly below around 400 is what we found. They maintain linearity, or it doesn't plateau that much until it reaches around 400. Plus the equations that they have used also are more accurate within this range. So I spoke to the manufacturer about it, and what they explained to me is that the unit has its own calibration curve, but they did their own calibrations and included curves. So that is something to consider when we use these units. And finally, further studies on methods used for particle sizing and accuracy and response under field conditions are important, because the particle sizes that they generate or they put out, meaning PM1, PM2.5, and PM10, is based on the equation that they input in that. So it might be better to use particle counts instead of the concentrations that these units spit out to get a more accurate reading. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Our next speaker is Tenchi Smith. Tenchi hails from the Mayo Clinic, and she will be sharing with us her presentation on running reduces systemic inflammation, yet worsens upper limb discomfort in a rat model of work-related musculoskeletal disorders. Tenchi, when you are going to switch your slides over, just say next slide, please, and the production house will help you out.
We'll definitely do that. Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Tenchi Smith. I currently work as a Senior Health Services Analyst at the Mayo Clinic in the Kern Center. Today, I have the honor of presenting my PPRT project, which was funded by the USF ERC, the Sunshine ERC, between 2018-2019. The title is Impact of Rest on Systemic Inflammation and Tissue Trauma in a Rat Model. Here I would like to thank my co-authors, my PhD advisors, Dr. Sean Gallagher, my mentors, Dr. Mary Barb and Dr. Christopher Newland, Cynthia Hutchison, Dr. Michael Roberts, Dr. Philip Guillard, Tricia Kendall, Dr. Bettina Shamira, Dr. Danielle McCullough, my committee members, Dr. Jerry Davis, Dr. Mark Shaw, Dr. Richard Sesek, and students, Yvonne, Sarah, and Sadak. So next, please. So first, let me give you some background and motivation of this study. It's important to note that musculoskeletal disorders, short as MSDs, are injuries and disorders that affect the human body's movement and musculoskeletal system in general. It's a significant disorder, and specifically work-related MSDs account for 32% of all workplace injuries, leading to a median of 12 lost workdays per case and costs about $2.6 billion annually in the US. For the past decade, it's been listed as a NORA, National Occupational Research Agenda strategic goal priority, specifically for work MSD prevention and control. As you can see above in the picture, the tissue starts off in a homeostasis status. Through cyclic loading, it continually receives trauma, starts form microtrauma, fissures, and eventually causes local structural damage and functional loss if not receiving adequate rest or treatment. So next, please. For this study, knowing the background and motivation, I identified some gaps in the current research. So some of the gaps are the MSD injury pathways are not very well understood at the moment. The healing mechanism in vivo is very complex. There's no definitive work rest cycle guidelines established to counter the MSDs, and further understanding is needed to discover the dose-response relationship between work scheduling and trauma. Specifically for this study, I aimed at investigating the impact of long and short between work rest breaks on muscle microtrauma development and developing a forced downhill treadmill running rat model in order to measure impact of long and short between work rest breaks. And lastly, examining the efficacy of commonly acclaimed secondary intervention methods for MSDs, such as treadmill running and rest, through a voluntary high repetition, high force lever pulling task for rats. Next, please. So here I try to show the experiment methods in one slide. The subjects I recruited were 24 young adult female sporadic dolly rats. They were randomly assigned to 3 treatment groups upon procurement: the control group, long infrequent rest group, and short frequent rest group. In the below chart and on the bottom, you should be able to see their daily schedules. The control rats were kept sedentary all day. Long infrequent rest rats worked for 40 minutes, rested for 120 minutes throughout the day. The short frequent rest rats worked for 20 minutes and rested for 60 minutes, and cycling that throughout the day. The treatment regimens were downhill running on the treadmill that's specifically built for rats. And downhill running is eccentric exercise at 15 degrees of decline at 12 meters per minute for 2 hours per day, 3 days per week, and for 3 weeks. During the work weeks for 3 weeks, and as well as at the end, several categories of data were collected. So the first category of data is body weight and tissue weight in order to gauge physiological adaptations amongst different groups of the rats. The second category of data is biomarkers, including CK, measuring for muscle damage, TNF-alpha, measuring systemic inflammation, MDA, oxidative stress. The biomarker measurements were all collected through serum assays. The third category of data collected were tissue morphology evaluations post-euthanasia, mostly through open microscopic observations. Nuclei counts were obtained through 3 non-adjacent FOVs, meaning fields of visions, using a specific software called QPath. And then cell shape and collagen organization were also observed under the microscope and scored between 1 and 3 using the Bonner scale. Next, please. Next, please. Thank you. The findings that I've generated from this study can be seen on this slide. The top left shows the body weights of the 3 different groups of rats over time. As we can see that the blue simplifies the control group. After the initial decline during adaptation, the body weight for the control rats consistently increased, which is normal, and basically is abiding by the growth curve, the normal growth curve. But in the green and orange, the normal growth, body weight growth trend was not observed. And instead, we can see that in the orange, the short frequent rest break group, the body weight never recovered during the 3 weeks of exercise regimens. In the green group, which is the long infrequent rest group, the body weight only recovered at the end and showing an increase right here in the green arrow. So, and I also showed the microscopic images for the control long infrequent rest and short frequent rest group rats on the upper right. Some of the biomarker data is visualized in the middle, and on the lower right is the cellularity score for the Achilles tendon, where we observed significant differences amongst the groups. So overall, the findings are the work regimen, meaning the task, suppressed normal weight gain over time. Greater fluctuation was observed in oxidative stress and weight over time in the long infrequent rest rats, and the long infrequent rest group rats adapted to the task faster than their alternatives. All right, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so very much, Tenchi.
Thank you.
All right, we have our final presenter coming up, Jay Christian. He's joining us from University of Kentucky, and Jay will be presenting disease surveillance and mapping systems for Kentucky. If you live in Kentucky, send your thanks his way.
Thank you, Dr. Kane. And thanks everybody for attending today virtually to hear me talk about the tick-borne disease surveillance and mapping system we have been developing for Kentucky. I'm an assistant professor in our Department of Epidemiology at the University of Kentucky. My collaborators are Jeff Levy in the Department of Geography, as well as Anna Pasternak, who is a graduate student in the Department of Entomology, and Reddy Polly, who is actually the chair of entomology. And we are funded by the Central Appalachian Regional ERC. So ticks are, of course, vectors for several different human diseases. First among these in terms of incidence is Lyme disease, which is diagnosed among tens of thousands of people every year in the United States alone. There are some other diseases here you may have heard of, particularly Rocky Mountain spotted fever, which is not particularly prevalent there, but is a concern for many different workers in outdoor occupations in the Northeast and around the Great Lakes area. Forestry and logging are other industries where potential hosts may encounter these vectors, as well as those who work in outdoor recreation in places like the Red River Gorge that you can see behind me. And of course, graduate students in entomology also may be exposed to ticks when they are out performing what we call tick drags. And these are sort of exactly what they sound like. An entomologist will go out into the forest and drag a blanket along the forest floor and to sample the ticks that latch on. So our graduate student, Anna Pasternak, did that at each of the locations on this map marked by one of these little red ticks. And this really helped us to fill out the areas of the state that have been sampled for tick species and the pathogens that they carry. So we now have fairly good representation over the entire state, although there are still a few counties we lack. So after collecting these samples in the field, they were brought back to the University of Kentucky, where, of course, we examined the samples to see which kinds of ticks we found, which species, and also the pathogens found within them. So Lone Star ticks were the most common. These are mostly found on white-tailed deer. They were found throughout the state and just about every county where we looked. The American dog tick was also quite common throughout the state. And deer ticks, which are very important because they carry Lyme disease, were only found, well, not only, but mostly found in the eastern half of the state. We did find a few in one county in western Kentucky, but it's also possible these were harder to sample with this methodology because the questing behavior of the ticks is somewhat different among the sort of northern and southern varieties of this particular species. The southern variety tends not to quest as high above the leaf litter. On the right, you can see the pathogens we found. Rocky Mountain spotted fever was most widespread around the state. And ehrlichiosis was also the pathogen that causes ehrlichiosis, also fairly common, but mostly in the eastern 2/3 of the state. Lyme disease was also found mostly in the eastern part of the state, though as we discussed, its primary vector, the Ixodes scapularis tick, it's possible we just didn't find many of those due to our sampling methodology in western Kentucky. And then here on this last slide, we're looking at the mapping system that my colleague in geography, Jeff Levy, has developed using ArcGIS Online. And this is just a static shot that shows a sample of some of the data layers we've added to the system. Besides the information I've just shown you about tick species and pathogens, we have also loaded in locations of workplaces for those occupations that are likely to encounter these little beasts. So stockyards, state parks. We have information about the intensity of farming in all of these counties and that sort of information. And of course, it's all linked together in this interactive map that we hope to, in the future, link up with some other tick-borne disease resources that our state public health department has developed. And perhaps this can get us a little bit closer to targeting some safety measures and guidelines a little more precisely. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christian. Appreciate your contribution. I'm trying to pick off ticks as we speak. It's been a really great range of presentations representing different types of skill sets and expertise, addressing either stakeholders directly or some aspect of quality of life that affects people, either in the field while you're working or certain work environments. I will say that I noticed a couple of commonalities from all of our presenters. And by the way, thank you all so very much for being able to try to distill down your research into a 5-minute slot. Those 5-minute TED Talks are incredibly challenging to produce. As most of you know that try to produce just a 250-word abstract, each of our presenters did a really, really great job. And I really got a good feel for the work that they were doing and the rationale behind it. I did notice that I think each investigator had some challenges that were faced with either information or data gaps that needed to be addressed in one form or another, and that each of the projects, and this is me reading into it, but I can think of an example from Dr. Christian, our last speaker, where there was some level of collaboration for each of these projects that helped the research to come to fruition based on a collaboration providing needed knowledge or expertise. So I think that I just wanted to pull that out, if that's, assuming that that's true from what I've heard from each of our presenters, that this is pretty common. It's not necessarily when you're starting out or doing novel research as in a pilot project, but I think that this is an ongoing type of process, and understanding that in research really is, I think, what we want to do to be supportive for all of us, particularly our young professionals and trainees. So we have some questions from the audience. I'm going to share these. Some of them are directed at individual speakers and some of them may be generic. So forgive me. I'm going to just start out with this one. This is for Jay Christian. I'm going backwards in order here. Has climate change, do you believe, played any role in altering the presence or distribution or abundance of ticks or tick species in Kentucky?
I'd say that's quite likely the case. You know, as climate changes, the ranges of certain species will adjust, and it may be that those that the ranges of ticks that carry certain pathogens are moving into places where they weren't before. Absolutely.
Do you have any data that drives this, that from your perspective helps to show the face of climate change?
Not yet, although we are still in the early stages of analyzing all of the tick samples we've got. There will certainly be some seasonality to the samples we collected, and there's also some issues when we collected a lot of this information was last year during the COVID pandemic, of course. So we didn't quite get the seasonality we hoped for. We didn't quite get, I think, the range of samples we wanted temporally, but research is ongoing.
Great, thank you. Here's a question for Dr. Dunleavy. In terms of working with clam farmers, did you have any challenges in terms of engaging with them such that your participants really bought into the value of your study?
I think there were a few things that really helped with that. Firstly, we were building off an established relationship that from a prior surveillance research project. So, you know, the introductions and buying in we were building off that in terms of the collaborations. I think there were some groups that we may not have recruited as such, and we did, and this is purely anecdotal, but there were a couple of people who we heard that coming into a research study where you're looking at pain or you know starting to look at low back pain, they were concerned about the potential. This is owners or supervisors' potential disability claims or lawsuits in the future. There has not been a lot in the industry currently, but there's been one or two that have cropped up. So, you know, very much the way that we recruited was through the Clam Worker Association, the Aquaculture Association. We did not have direct involvement with the different units, but that's what we were sort of hearing. At the same time, the groups that did actually participate, you know, we went and talked to their managers, to their leaders, and got full approval. And so the ones that we were working with, in a way, we had a really good unit to be able to work with. I can say that there was one other group where the managerial staff did not want workers to be given time off for the research, and so we weren't able to recruit them. So those were some of the challenges that we had recruiting participants.
Thank you. So it seems that by partnering in the community with community partners to help work with the stakeholders, that was very helpful for you.
Absolutely. That was critical.
Fantastic. Thank you. This next question is for Chad Nyman. And so apparently I'm not the only one who feels like forestry is perhaps poorly understood in this group. Could you please share with us some of the highest risk hazards that forestry workers in Kentucky face today?
That's a great question. So there are these large trees, they're a huge amount of weight, and so they're using, in some cases, a chainsaw to manually fell those trees. And so, as you might think, limbs falling out of those trees and striking someone in the head, or that tree potentially kicking back and, you know, hurting that individual at the base of the tree is where most of the injuries occur. And so Back in December, we had a double fatality in Clay County, Kentucky. A father and son were working in the woods, and they were both killed by the same tree, working in close proximity to one another. And so it's just one example of how, one of these large trees and coming down in a way that they're not anticipating could strike and kill someone very quickly. But then you've got the aspect of the heavy equipment that they're using and rough terrain. And then you look outside at the weather conditions we've got with the ice and the snow. And so you're far from any emergency personnel services and communication. You may not have cell phone signal in these areas. There's a lot of issues that can make this even more difficult and more dangerous. And so that inherent danger paired with all of that remoteness, it makes it a very difficult profession and dangerous one.
It is. It's a really dangerous profession. That extends. I mean, I live in Florida, and I know that even timber trucks pulling out onto the highway or onto the road from falling sites, even that alone, that can happen 30, 40 times a day from a single drive. And the hazards even associated with that are enormous and don't even touch what actually goes on during the falling process and all of the other prep work that gets done in the field.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Excellent. This next question is for Rusmin, and this question is a little bit different. Let me see if I can get this wording down right. You're focusing on low-cost units, and you emphasized, certainly correctly, that calibration or validation is really important. Acceptance of low-cost units is really what the question looks like. There's a cultural acceptance by various user groups, whether they're with the Department of Health or they're academics working on research and collecting data, or you're using citizen science. There's a million ways that instrumentation becomes adapted and used in the field. And obviously cost is one of the major factors that affects the ability of a new product to come to service, right? And so I'm going to take a moment from that question and have an example of that. And that is for analytical toxicology, there is a solid phase extraction method called the Catcher's method. And it's abbreviated with a bunch of letters. Catcher's is not spelled like a catcher's mitt, but it's Q-U-E-C-H-E-R-S, and each of those letter groups are really an acronym for quick, easy, cheap, effective, rugged, and safe, right? And so not all of instrumentation needs to have all of those qualities necessarily, but that acceptance is a big part of it. And the part that wasn't captured there is the cultural acceptance. And in that case, cost really isn't even a factor. The fact that it's low cost really is a barrier breaker. So do you think that there are any cultural barriers to the adoption of some of these devices that you can talk
about? That's a very good intro and a good point. So I think the main change that happened over time is that people got more interested. So as more people realized the harmful effects of air pollution, there was much more interest on air pollution health effects. And it also was fueled by certain events that happen, wildfires, very high levels in Beijing and Shanghai. The Olympics actually made a huge difference. The knowledge on air pollution that came out of that, the athletes were concerned. So I think there were these peaks in time that really fueled the interest in people on the effects of air pollution, they wanted to be protected, because I think also people were seeing that their kids or they themselves were getting asthma, and people were actually feeling the effects. One of the main barriers, even though these units are low cost for scientists, because we are used to $5,000, $6,000, $100,000 equipment, it's still around $250, $200, still much, much better than it was. But one of the barriers is, I can explain it through an example, is in New York City, we were doing some research projects with the low-cost housing units. And for them, it was a mix of not knowing the harmful effects. And second is what do you really do about it? So yes, you can measure, but what do I do about it? Sometimes knowing can cause, a fear or a concern in the community, but the community probably has other issues that they're more concerned about. So that is sometimes a barrier to introducing these units. But still, if more people can use them, especially in environmental measurements, you can identify hotspots. And even if it's not the specific area, you can get a general idea of where it is. But still, I would highly recommend for scientific research or even for research with communities, I would still say we have to calibrate, because the data for scientific inference depends on the accuracy. And if we are going with it, I think it's good to get an estimate in the community and understand the hotspots and where to go, where not to go, and so on, or where it's higher if there was an issue. But as scientists, if we're using it for a scientific process or an experiment, I think we should still have the accuracy of data as the number one factor. So calibration is, yeah.
Absolutely, Rusmin. And so that's almost more of a validation, because there's not a single instrument that any scientist would use without knowing that it can be calibrated or that it is calibrated, right? I mean, it doesn't matter what the cost of it or even how long it's been used. I have a pH meter. Every day I use it. Start with a 2-point calibration. It doesn't matter.
Exactly. That's the other issue, is how well would this hold up over time? If you use these units once, twice, 3 times, if you expose it to very high concentrations, will it last? But it's an exciting new area. And the good thing is, with the Internet of Things, you can combine this with so many other software platforms. That is one of the biggest advantages it has over the older units, is because it can connect to other people through profiles. It can connect to different analysis tools and so on. So it actually helps the communities quite a bit in larger projects.
That's great. And this is my tag onto the same question. I mean, I've got one last question for the session. Also for you, Rusmin, this is an example of, I think your presentation also shows a need for error monitoring and the ability to come up with instrumentation, but the ability to adapt instrumentation from other sciences, other types of instrumentation that can give different complementary data that can help with a weight of evidence, as sometimes is really important. One example of the kind of creativity that you were describing was from a Bill Gates challenge, and this was to be able to, and I believe sub-Saharan Africa, be able to clinically determine TB positive nature in patients, but happening in the middle of a desert where you can't plug anything in. And so the grant challenge was, how do you test for TB where you can't plug something in? And the winning award for that actually became pretty fulcral in that it was actually the training of Gambian pouch rats, right? So these rats were trained to have an amazing sense of smell, and they were trained by giving them bananas to be able to smell tuberculosis in sputum. And they were able to do that with like a 90%, positive rate without false positives. And so it was a very low-tech opportunity to be able to, take something that was way out in the field to be able to really make an impact clinically in that case. But it also really took out-of-the-box thinking. So I really want to applaud, what you've done, but also mention that you can really take that. Everybody can take that kind of thinking as far as you need to. It's a matter of what the need is, and really breaking that barrier, using your creative juices to find out the best way to sort of get the answers needed or to provide the information that's being requested.
Right.
This last question that I have is for Tenchi, and it's a generic question. Please, good luck with this one. The question is, so does this mean that exercise is good for just removing inflammation? If I have body inflammation, so exercise is just good for getting rid of systemic inflammation in general?
That is a really, really good question. So I'm not a medical doctor per se, but I've always been interested in, this is like my main interest for my dissertation, is how rest and work affect the development and recovery of musculoskeletal disorders. And when you start, talking about the injury mechanism of the development of musculoskeletal disorders, you cannot go around inflammation. Like the first step is to develop inflammation, systemic inflammation, and then the cells in your body starts working, trying to fight it and help you. And then that, if you remember, if you have a mental image of one of the slides that I have for the background and motivation, then the tissue, if it's normal, it looks actually beautiful. It's in a homeostatic stasis status, and it's very linear and parallel. And then once it reaches a stage where the rest is not sufficient enough for it to heal, the inflammation is not enough to resolve its problem at the beginning stage, the microtrauma starts to form. If that continues, meaning that the trauma is greater than the recovery, then bigger fissures and structural damage will happen. So inflammation is always the first step. And I said it very quickly in my presentation, but some of the highly touted intervention for musculoskeletal disorder is exercise. But it's interesting that you brought it up, because in this study, we actually found out that the exercise in a way, the treatment in a way is an exercise, but in this study is meant to be simulating work. So work is not meant to be recreational or healing. It's meant to be somewhat traumatizing to the rats, and it actually did that. So it affected their normal weight gain. It negatively affected their oxidative stress level, and their cellularity, their tissue morphology, in another way to say it, in their tendons. So in this way, in the study, we found out that exercise, this work exercise, if you have a manual job, it's actually not going to help with the inflammation. But the traditional intervention that was highly touted, saying that, oh, exercise is good for you, you cannot say that's false either, because in another study that I've done that's also using rat models, which I will be glad to send you the publication for, whoever asked the question or whoever is interested. We actually found out that the flat treadmill running, if it's overly rigorous, it's actually damaging and not healing enough for the rats. At least that's the subjects that we used. So some sort of intermediate state exercise that's more or less customed for the patient or whoever is in rehab, or whoever is interested in doing the exercise, custom for the maximum strength or the strength level of the subject, custom variation of exercise may be beneficial for controlling of the systemic inflammation. But in short, one type or one rigorous level or one rigor level of the exercise may not cure all, if that answers it.
Does, yes.
Dr. Kane, may I respond to that?
Please.
So, Dr. Smith, I agree, and I think that certainly in humans, there are some differences with rats versus humans, but the sort of combination of the load, the amount of load, the concentration of the load, the rest to be able to recover and return to homeostasis is all linked. And once it reaches that point where there is actual tissue damage, at some of the more recent research that is on running injuries, for example, or anybody who has more of a repetitive strain injury, is that it's how you return them to those loads that really makes a difference. In other words, the tissues are not strong enough to be able to maintain the previous level that they were at. And so constant damage actually occurs if you go straight back to what you're doing. But my question is related to your particular study, is for the short rests versus the longer rests, how did you come up with those times? Did you have a previous study that you looked at or other research on the time that you used for the actual rest periods?
Great questions. Thank you for raising those questions. And to answer your question, yes, indeed. There was not one study that I just looked at and I was like, oh, this is perfect for me. You know, I'm going to do the short rest as, like 20/60. I'm going to do the long rest as a 40 and 120. There's no straight answer from one particular publication. If there was one, I probably would have given up on my idea because it has already been published. But I did find inspiration in several of the studies. My criteria for searching for these studies is what defines long? What defines a long work and long rest versus short work and short rest for rats? And what makes it compatible or comparable between rat model and the human model? And what kind of study is doable on the rats that can be inspirational, or the findings can be translational and meaningful for human models. So those are my criteria looking for the publications for this study. And I was able to find a few that kind of gave a range of what they had done. Some of the studies may have only done control versus work. Some of the studies may have done control versus intermediate amount of work and high level of work. And then some of the study gave me inspirations for how to design the eccentric exercise for rats on a treadmill model. And that's how I selected the overall duration of the study is 3 weeks. I don't want to select something that's overly long that exhausts myself taking care of the rats. I don't, or like me working for 12 hours per day. I have to interlay because it's just basically a one-man shop, like I did it. So I have to kind of schedule the rats so that I'm with them during their exercise all the time. And then they are procured at the same time and they terminate at the same time. So I finally was able to find one that can potentially demonstrate statistical significance from what I read from the publications. It works with my schedule and the rat schedule that, I'm not working against their circadian rhythm. And then the treadmill angles is based on the literature and the number of weeks total and the number of hours total are making sense based on literature, if that answers your question.
We're out of time for the session. Those are all really great questions. I really appreciate the questions from the audience. And I really, really appreciate the contributions from our presenters. A lot goes into these presentations and I've learned a lot. And the questions that we've received indicates that you've engaged with our audience. And I really love the personal attention that you put into all of your research, the fact that you find inspiration in what you do and that you're finding needs and gaps based on working with stakeholders or working with clinical issues. And Bully, for all of you, that's great. That's really great work. You guys are all folks to be watched in the field, and we'll be following along, and hopefully you'll be joining us again next year. All right, so we're going to end this session. Let me just share with you a couple of quick housekeeping notes. We've got a 10-minute break now, or 9 minutes left at this point, to check out some center director updates if you haven't yet. And if not, please get up, stretch, grab a nibble, and come back at 2:10 for our final presentation session, pilot presentations, beginning at 2:10 for about an hour. And actually, we've got 2 sessions starting at 2:10, and then we'll have a wrap up following that. So thank you all for your attention. We'll see you shortly.